Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're embarking on a pretty fascinating journey to understand exactly how humanity manages to feed itself. We're going to zoom all the way out and look at the entire global landscape of agriculture. We'll trace the incredible evolution of food production, starting from the smallest, most isolated family plots, all the way up to the massive, highly mechanized global networks that completely define modern agribusiness. My hope is that the next time you walk down the aisle of a grocery store, you'll know exactly how all that food actually got there. Okay, let's dive right in.
To truly wrap our heads around the massive scale of what we're talking about, just consider this staggering number, 50%. Even in today's highly digital, fast-paced world, more than 50% of the people in most countries across Asia and Africa are employed directly in the agricultural sector. That means, for literally half the population in these vast regions, their everyday livelihood, their survival, is tied directly to the earth.
Before we get into all the complex modern methods, let's just ground ourselves with the absolute basics. The word agriculture actually comes from two Latin words, ager, which means field, and cultura, meaning to cultivate. But, the modern definition goes way beyond just planting seeds in a field. Agriculture encompasses a huge range of activities. It includes rearing animals for dairy and meat, poultry farming, and even raising fish in ponds. It's a whole ecosystem of cultivation.
So here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at farming for survival. Second, maximizing small spaces. Third, massive-scale farming. And finally, finding the balance. Let's jump right into our first section.
Section 1. Farming for survival. Farming for survival encompasses some of the absolute oldest, most localized, and deeply traditional methods of producing food on the planet. We call this subsistence farming. It's practiced by farmers who own only very small pieces of land. And the crucial thing to understand here is the goal. They are growing just enough crops, usually staples like rice or vegetables, to meet the immediate needs of their own families. There's basically no surplus left over to sell or trade. They rely heavily on the natural environment, depending entirely on monsoon rains for water and using organic natural fertilizers like cow dung, animal droppings, and dried plants to nourish the soil. It is a completely self-contained loop.
Another really ancient form of farming for survival is shifting cultivation, which you might know as slash and burn. The cycle goes like this. Farmers use machetes to cut down a small patch of forest. Next, they burn all the debris. Why? Well, because those ashes actually make the soil incredibly fertile. So they sow their seeds in that ash-rich dirt and rely entirely on tropical rains to water the crops. But here's the catch. After a few years, the soil totally loses its fertility. When that happens, the farmers are forced to just abandon that plot, move to a new patch of forest, and start the entire cycle all over again.
And this practice is incredibly global. In India, they call it juming. In Indonesia, lading. In Brazil, roca. And down in Central America, it's known as milpa. But despite its really rich history, this method presents some serious modern challenges. Because it requires constantly clearing new land, it disturbs the local ecology, displaces wildlife from their natural habitats, and contributes heavily to soil erosion, especially during those heavy monsoon seasons. So what happens when you don't have vast forests to move into? What happens when land is incredibly scarce, but you still have a massive population to feed?
Well, that brings us to Section 2, maximizing small spaces.
When land is super scarce, the answer is intensive farming. You'll see this a lot in densely populated areas like the Ganga Plain in India, or in countries like China, Korea, and Japan. The farmer still only has a small plot of land, but their approach is entirely different from subsistence farming. Here they're using expensive, high-yielding hybrid seeds. They apply tons of fertilizers, sometimes even including what's called night soil, which is actually solid human waste collected and used as a super potent natural fertilizer. They also rely on irrigation canals instead of just hoping for rain, and they use highly skilled labor. To squeeze every single ounce of value from the dirt, they practice double or even multiple cropping. That means growing 2 or more crops on the exact same piece of land in a single year to guarantee multiple streams of income.
But there is a pretty significant downside to all this. Intensive farming relies heavily on chemical pesticides and fertilizers to maintain those massive yields. And sadly, this heavy use doesn't just target the pests, it wipes out highly beneficial insects too, like ladybirds and butterflies, and even the natural earthworms that keep the soil rich in nutrients. Birds will often eat these poisoned insects and become victims themselves. So the takeaway here is that while it absolutely maximizes the output per acre, intensive farming can be devastating to the local ecology.
Let's completely flip the script now. Section 3. Massive-scale farming.
Let's shift our perspective from those tiny, crowded plots in Asia to regions where the land is seemingly endless. We're looking at a pretty stark contrast here. On one hand, you have intensive farming with its intense human labor and focus on maximizing a single acre. On the other hand, you have extensive farming,
This is what you find in the temperate grasslands of the world, places like the USA, Canada, and Australia. Out there, the average farm size is a staggering 1,000 to 2,000 acres. Because human labor is actually scarce in these low-population areas, farmers have to rely on massive total output spread across vast distances rather than squeezing every drop out of one tiny acre. The technological difference is literally night and day. While intensive setups rely heavily on human sweat and animal-driven plows, extensive farming is practically all done by enormous machines, like the massive combine harvester. Whether they're growing wheat, maize, or barley, everything is mechanized. Honestly, without this heavy machinery, making any kind of profit on 2,000 acres of land would be completely impossible.
Now, when extensive farming focuses entirely on selling produce at home and abroad, it steps into the realm of commercial farming, which you probably know as agribusiness. The absolute main goal here is profit. To make that happen, agribusinesses pour huge capital investments into high-yielding variety, or HYB seeds, intense chemical fertilizers, and modern irrigation tech. And because they're selling to a global market, a huge requirement is investing heavily in cold storage facilities. That's how they safely market and transport diverse products, everything from the cheeses and dairy you buy at the store to wines, mushrooms, and fresh vegetables shipped right across the entire globe.
This technological divide is honestly a bit jarring when you think about it. You have a farmer manually spraying his small, intensive plot with a little backpack sprayer, existing in the exact same global economy as commercial, mechanized spraying pulled by a massive tractor over a seemingly endless field. It so clearly highlights the immense financial and technological gap between local, intensive farming and global commercial agribusiness.
Within that commercial farming world, there's a very specific, fascinating type known as plantation farming. Unlike typical farms that grow a bunch of different crops, a plantation is a vast estate dedicated to cultivating just one single cash crop. We're talking tea leaves, the coffee in your morning cup, rubber, or sugarcane. These massive operations require enormous capital investment just to get off the ground. They need highly skilled laborers to process the crops in factories right on site, and extreme quality control, mostly because they're catering directly to international buyers who have very, very high standards.
So where does all this leave us? Section 4. Finding the balance.
We've seen farming driven by sheer survival, by a total lack of space, and by massive global profits. So how do we balance all these competing needs? Well, one highly efficient method is mixed farming. This is a system where crops are grown and animals are reared on the exact same piece of farmland. It's incredibly popular in places like Europe, the USA, and Australia. You might have cows and goats for milk, sheep for wool, and crops all basically supporting one another in a shared ecosystem. It's a brilliant way to maximize the utility of the land while providing multiple streams of steady income for the farmer.
But as we zoom back out to the global level, we're facing a massive, mounting tension. On one side of the scale, we have the UN's Sustainable Development Goal 2, Zero Hunger. Agriculture is humanity's absolute most powerful tool for reducing poverty and feeding an expected 9.7 billion people by the year 2050. But on the other side of the scale, modern farming practices, especially the heavy use of chemical fertilizers, massive machinery, and clearing of land, are drastically raising global greenhouse gas emissions. This causes immense ecological problems and, ironically, threatens our future crop yields because of climate change.
Which leaves us with a final, absolutely vital question. How can humanity balance the desperate need to feed billions of people with the severe ecological damage caused by modern farming? We've seen the traditional methods that just struggle to yield enough food, and we've seen the highly mechanized methods that harm the earth. The future of our global food supply depends entirely on how we innovate to bridge this exact gap. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this gives you a brand new perspective the next time you sit down for a meal. Keep asking questions and keep exploring.